they really want to start at like 11:25.
Yeah.
We have a fair amount to get through.
Yeah. Do you want to start us off? And then I can...
Yeah, okay. I'll lift them up with some prayer.
Okay.
Dear Father, thank you for this day and everything that you've provided for us. Thank you for John's message this morning and that reminder of how marriage really ultimately reflects the love that you have for us. And I just want to thank you for that gift. I pray that as we're going into the holiday season, that we'll be able to love people like how you love us. That we'll be encouraged to just reach out to someone and really show them the light of Jesus in this world. So we love you so much, and in Jesus' name, amen. Yeah, so this week we're going through the part 2 of the Historicity of the New Testament. Specifically, we're going over the philosophical background or philosophical assumptions behind a lot of this debate. And so we'll end up seeing it fall kind of into a couple different camps. And then, so here's some of our topics that we're going to go over. Philosophical background this week. Next week, key claims of the New Testament and skeptics. And then we'll get into actual evidences supporting or denying the New Testament. Here's some of our sources. So Cold Case Christianity, I've been relying on quite heavily. Mm-hmm. Miracles by C.S. Lewis is another phenomenal book. Really anything by C.S. Lewis, but for the modern age, I do think Miracles and actually, believe it or not, The Abolition of Man is a great one. Because it goes into morality. It goes into morality and why. Yeah, and also the problem of pain. So big questions and pretty great answers. Last week we covered historical investigation and how you can really view it like a crime scene investigation. When we're looking at something in the past, we don't have the ability to change what happened in the past. We don't, a lot of times, don't have the ability to go back and interview people in the past. So instead, we have to look at what was preserved. We have to look at documentation, and we have to be very detailed and really hang on every single word, like he says in the book, and come up with possible explanations that most fit everything. Mm-hmm. And of course that uses abductive reasoning, which is kind of like a combination of deductive and inductive reasoning, but the goal is to find the most likely or the most reasonable explanation, mm-hmm. not simply only one single explanation.
Yeah.
So this week, once again, we're talking about the philosophical background behind all this. And the idea that we really want to drive in is that presuppositions and biases can actually lead us astray. When we make up our mind first before approaching a particular topic, mm-hmm. we'll often come away with a wrong answer. Mm-hmm. Let's put it that way. So, yeah.
Yeah, to some point for that presupposition, it can't be avoided. We kind of have to have some sort of assumption that we take, but we got to make sure that assumption is reasonable.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to go into. I'm going to start with a few of the logical fallacies. I'm sure you guys are going to be at least somewhat familiar with these because whenever engaging with people in conversations like this, I do this. This is something that I studied quite a bit in school, actually, from high school through college, and unfortunately, people when I first started engaging in these conversations, I'd point these out when they were taking place, and everyone always responds super negatively to that, so I don't do that anymore.
Really?
But yeah, and it's funny because if someone did that to me, I think I would be like, yeah, you're right. You know what I mean?
So pointing out, that's a straw man.
Yeah, that's a straw man.
Else people are actually, I don't want to talk about
I don't want to talk about that. Yeah, but it's still good to know because you can actually write it off. Because logical fallacies, the key about logical fallacies, it can't be argued against because it's a fallacy. So there's no reasoning that you can do once someone wants to engage you in the fallacy. You have to cut it off right there. Yep. You know what I mean? So I'm going to go through some of the most common ones that I see.
So when are logical fallacies used?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to do. Honestly, I think it's a great question. I think most people use them on accident because I think people are trying to sound smart or try to get a cheap win. You know what I mean? And this is the best way to kind of shut someone up because if you a great example is the first one actually, ad hominem. So that's attacking the person rather than attacking the idea.
Yeah.
So ask ChatGPT to give me some examples within apologetics, and it says that you're just a Bible thumper, so of course you would argue that Jesus exists, right? That's not actually attacking the idea at all. It's actually attacking the person.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
exactly.
So,
Many sort of examples, but I do think the most common is just attacking someone's character or their appearance or something along those lines, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we do that on the opposite side as well. It's like, well, Stephen Hawking is just an atheist, so we shouldn't believe what he has to say.
Oh, sure.
You know, and it's like, well, maybe he does have something to say about string theory, you know? So there's a bunch of them. Straw man, this is another one that's really important that we don't do. It's attacking a setup, easier example of the argument. So the example ChatGPT gave us, I believe that God created the universe. That's person A. And the person B says, oh, you think God just waved a magic wand and poof, everything appeared out of nowhere? And the answer is no, that's not what they believe, but it's easier to argue against that than it is to take on the claim that God created the universe.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a bunch of those. Most of these kind of make sense. Appeal to authority, there's no reason that you should appeal to authority in general, right? If you're not attacking the argument itself, it can be a good piece of inductive reasoning,
sure,
but it doesn't get rid of it.
Yeah, in a logical argument, right? Very often in statistics, we'll see, well, I referenced this thing, or I referenced that thing, or like medicine, it's just all about like, well, what about this study or that study?
Right.
There's so many, I guess you could call them appeals to authority, but from a purely logical perspective, there's no reason for that.
Yeah.
There's no additional information that an authority is really going to introduce.
And the other thing is you can often find authorities on either side of the issue. You know.
And that goes very much with what we talked about last week, in the idea of even a sort of authority. If you read a book or whatever, that's kind of like an expert witness testimony or statement that you're taking, and you can actually weigh that critically, right? If there's someone telling you things and they're just claiming these things are true, and then it comes out that they were lying about it, or that they knew that it was untrue, but they were still putting it up that way, then you have a real reason to start doubting some of the things that they were saying.
And I think that's probably the main point. It's like, just because they're an authority doesn't necessarily make the argument stronger.
Exactly.
It means that they're probably better at making the argument. You know?
Yeah.
So I'm gonna skip through most of these because they're just they're good, but they're not like super important. I think the most important one though is circular reasoning, because hey guys,
Hi.
Circular reasoning is actually one that we have to take as Christians. So we're talking about logical fallacies just right now. So yeah, very exciting stuff. But all of these, what we're saying is you can't engage in them because they're bad questions to begin with. And the circular reasoning, though, specifically, we as Christians have to accept it because one of our core assumptions is that the Bible is true. But the reason we believe the Bible is true is because the Bible says it's true, right? So it's not a logically sound argument. So
it is. Yeah, I would say it's not the only argument Christians make. For example, Wallace in his book doesn't make that argument. He says, well, no, you can test that the Gospels, that their claims are valid.
Right.
And then he goes from there.
Right, I was about to say, it's not a reason not to believe it, right?
Yeah.
But because there's many reasons, inductive reasons, to believe that the Bible is true, based on the historicity, which we're going to get into in other classes. But ultimately, our two assumptions, I'm going to go back to assumptions, are that the Bible is real and the God of the Bible is who the Bible says he is. Right, so those are two key assumptions, and then from there it actually becomes circular, and that has something to do with faith as well, right? I mean, our belief is on the basis of faith. Great book about that. Kierkegaard writes a book called Fear and Trembling. He talks all about why faith is probably the highest virtue over something like reason. It's just really great. Just plug out there. And then these other ones are pretty simple, like appeal to emotion. Emotion doesn't have anything to do with argument. Appeal to hypocrisy. So if someone's making an argument but they themselves don't do it, it's not actually a good reason not to believe them, right? Because the argument can still be solid even if they can't do it themselves.
It's like Nestorius.
Which one?
Well, he argued for a particular view of who Jesus Christ is.
Mary, the mother of God, was the Nestorian argument.
I think so,
yeah.
Something like that. Anyway, and then he didn't actually believe his argument himself.
Right.
He just pitted it, threw it out there, and then it got named after him. And
and he
widely
probably
labeled
didn't follow that. Yeah, I see what you mean. He probably didn't believe it himself. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we can, those other ones make sense too.
Yeah, but the key point is when making an argument, these often are, I guess you could say, shortcuts. And that aren't valid, that don't actually lead anywhere, but seem to lead somewhere.
Yeah.
And this was actually a thing I did, the whole AI image generator thing for this.
Yeah.
And one thing that I thought was really funny to go along with this is none of the gears actually connect.
Yeah, no, I was looking at that when I saw this. I'm like, what? Yeah,
so I figured it kind of makes sense, like logical fallacies, like, oh, you're trying to put two gears together, but don't actually connect them.
That's funny.
So yeah, and then we're going to talk about cognitive biases. So it's actually kind of difficult to come up with a good definition for cognitive bias.
Sure.
They're very similar to logical fallacies, but they differ in a couple different ways. And so I did the good old look it up in an encyclopedia. And so Britannica says that cognitive biases are systematic errors in the way individuals reason about the world due to subjective perception of reality. So these, whereas logical fallacies are applied to a particular argument, these kind of help illuminate why that particular argument is being brought up or where it comes from.
Yeah. It's more like intrinsic to the person rather than the argument.
Yeah, and there's a massive list of cognitive biases, which even on the one on Wikipedia is not exhaustive by all means. And there's a lot of overlap between stuff. But an example is cognitive bias. So that's when people tend to draw conclusions that support their own presuppositions rather than what is actually supported by evidence. So for example, there's one example given in the book called Case for Christianity, where says that this happened in a homicide investigation where the senior detective said, like, oh, you know what, I know that the husband did it before even really investigating the crime scene, and he just picked out certain things, like the victim was on the bed, that there was a picture of a couple embracing that was turned over, that clothes were missing from the closet, and there was no forced entry, that were all signs, he said, that, oh, it's just almost certainly the husband or some sort of lover. But instead, it wasn't actually that case. It was her neighbor who had, talked his way in and then ended up raping and killing her. And so simply because you have some sort of preconceived notion of that, if a wife is dead, then it's probably because of the husband. That doesn't necessarily make it true, of course. Right. And there's many of these. I'll go over a couple more. Selection bias is when people choose examples to support their own broader conclusions, not knowing that the chosen examples don't accurately represent all possible explanations. So oftentimes this one is done by mistake, where you'll go interviewing people and then realize that I was interviewing only people in a particular suburb, so they're from a particular demographic group and don't represent all demographic groups. Or the kind of absurd case I have is when you only interview lottery ticket winners instead of losers, and so then you would get a misunderstanding of maybe like what it takes to win a lottery. You might figure out that there are things you can do to win a lottery when in reality there's nothing that you besides buying a ticket.
Right.
The halo effect is when people, you may see someone's positive or negative traits or attributes from one area of personality and then apply that same sort of positiveness to another area. So, for example, assuming that someone who looks athletic is actually athletic, or someone who looks smart is actually smart, that type of thing.
Yeah.
There's egocentric bias, which is a group of biases actually, that rely too heavily on their perspective or perception of themselves, so of someone, not someone else, but of yourself compared to others. So, for example, someone who's overconfident may claim that they're capable of doing something when they're not actually capable of doing that, like the Dunning-Kruger effect. I don't know if you've heard of that, but that's an example of some sort of egocentric bias. So a bunch, but the point is these can kind of help maybe when someone's making a particular argument or whatever to try to figure out, in addition to any potential logical fallacies that they have, where their particular presuppositions are coming from, and then maybe you can attack those directly as opposed to fighting through all the weeds.
And I think that's super important because I think as Christians we've been kind of backed into a corner to accept our assumptions. You know what I mean? So when people come at us and say you're looking at this from this perspective, oftentimes we've examined that in ourselves out of just necessity.
Yeah.
Whereas like the other side, like the atheistic side or more skeptical side, they've kind of had the luxury of not needing to look inside as much as we have, right?
Yeah.
So which is unfortunate,
exactly. And
you know?
and with the advent of empiricism, of science, you don't just simply have assumptions that then make their way into the world. Rather, what happens into the world makes its way back into your assumptions a little
Right,
bit, right?
You're 100% right
And
on
so
that.
we know that good assumptions lead to good outcomes, and bad assumptions lead to bad outcomes in the world. And this is kind of one of the things that we talked about last week, or not last week, a couple weeks ago, as to the Christian life is almost self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And so starting with the assumptions of Christianity, you would expect one to lead a good life.
Right.
You would expect one to have a relationship that draws them closer to God.
Yeah, that's all good stuff. Okay, so speaking of assumptions, we're going to get into some of the ones that we actually have to all hold. So taking a switch from looking at it from a Christian perspective, we're getting into apologetics here. So apologetics, I like to break it out differently between apologetics and theology being the assumptions that you take. To study theology, you have to accept that the God of the Bible is real and the Bible is, or it is who the Bible says he is, right? Yeah. And the Bible is true. To study apologetics, you don't have to do that. You only have to take the same assumptions that other people, secular empiricists, are going to take. So these are kind of some of the main assumptions that we're all going to take as we engage in these. And like I said, we can come at it from the same perspective of like, did Jesus exist? Did he raise from the dead? And so I'm going to go over them quickly because they really do make sense. The principle of plausibility is that events occur within a historical context can be compared to other similar events within history, right? If you can't compare an event that took place at Jesus' time with an event that took place recently, you can't draw conclusions between the two, right? They could just be completely different from each other and not even comparable. So that's an assumption. You can't prove that, but you have to hold on to it. You can also observe it even within your own life, right? Things happened yesterday similar to the way they happened today. So it makes sense, but it seems trivial, but it's actually not. You know, it is an assumption that we have to hold. Also, the thing about assumptions is we can't break them. So since that we do hold this assumption, if we think that people are inherently skeptical and they do not believe in miracles today, that they wouldn't believe in those a long time ago.
Yeah.
Right, which is something that we don't.
And it takes a lot of work and honesty if you do end up finding out that one of your assumptions is wrong. Then there's a lot of, you gotta take that or come up with an alternative to it that replaces it, and then go through all the work that you did before.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of what they did during the Enlightenment, right? Was to deconstruct the Catholic narrative. To an extent, that was a good thing. So another one is consistency as independent sources. That is actually an assumption. We can't prove this, but if you have one source that says one thing and you find another source that says the same thing, to say that those are probably true from a historical standpoint is an assumption, right? It makes sense. It's a good inductive reasoning, but you can't prove it. So that's one that we have to hold. That's a strong piece of evidence. Another one is that historical events are understandable. If they weren't understandable, why would we even study them? And then eyewitness testimonies are valuable sources. So this is one that gets talked a lot. But in reality, that's like the strongest piece of evidence, as Kal was saying, in the courtroom, right?
Exactly. It often is the strongest piece of evidence in the courtroom. And if we don't have eyewitness testimony or, at least some amount of documentation around it, then we have no history.
Right.
All history that we have has been written down by someone and then conveyed to us through those means.
Exactly.
Or orally even.
Yep.
But the point is, it's still from someone, and so that sort of idea of witness testimony is key to all of history. If you want to have any history at all, you need to have witness testimony.
100%. And like you were saying last week, the best example of that is like we have more historical eyewitness events, writings saying that Jesus existed than Plato existed, right? Nobody wonders if Plato exists, but we all like to question if Jesus existed.
Exactly. We have a ton of evidence as to that. So we're getting into two of the, I guess, what you would say, bases of primary assumptions that historians will start with. So, for example, we'll get into naturalism, and then we'll get into miracles. But philosophical naturalism really is a philosophical assumption. It's something that people start with, and that they don't actually derive from experience. And it is the assumption that only natural law and forces exist. So, as a result, your conclusions must be limited to only what we can see, test, reproduce, etc. And so it's actually really interesting how anything supernatural, anything that would be considered a miracle, is just excluded by default.
Yeah. And again, that's where that assumption is so important, because it's like there's not a reason to necessarily believe that,
Yep, exactly. Naturalism says if we can observe it, then it cannot be supernatural by definition.
Yeah.
And so this is a very, very key thing, and it's important to make sure that you check those when you're getting into a discussion with someone about this sort of thing, is you understand where they're coming from, because if they're coming from this perspective, they're just never going to accept certain parts of the New Testament.
Yeah, and I think a key point, could you go back to the other slide a second? So when we're talking about the philosophical assumptions, when we're getting into debates about historicity, these are the ones that you have to hold, because you can't get anywhere after that.
Yeah.
The supernaturalist versus naturalist assumptions on the next slide, those you don't have to hold it. Right, they don't actually come into play.
Exactly. That is a really, really big point. Is oftentimes people will hold this naturalistic perspective or a supernaturalistic perspective when they don't actually have to hold that to investigate whether the events are true or not.
Right. Yeah.
So they'll naturalists is what they're often called. Will say that this idea, this assumption, really is what they call a priori, or which is Latin for communicating that a particular belief or argument comes from first principles. Or in other words, they argue that the belief in naturalism comes from something other than experience. So the belief is down here and experience is up here. And instead of experience informing naturalism, it's the other way around, where there's something deeper below that says we get to naturalism and then up. So it's often conflated with science. So many people will just say, oh, science is naturalism and that is it. When in reality, there are many assumptions that science makes that is not compatible with a naturalistic perspective. People make attempts to reconcile the two, but the moral argument always comes back. In order to do science, you need to believe that it's good, and naturalism provides no way for explaining moralistic tendencies.
I've actually heard I've heard secular people say something quite well when they're doing the scientific method, is that does assume naturalism, in the sense that like the answers we're going to get from science, that they're going to be repeatable and they take place within the natural world.
Sure.
That assumes naturalism, but that doesn't mean naturalism is true, right?
Yeah.
Which is a key text, because when we talk about historicity, we shouldn't take that assumption of naturalism and apply it to a different discipline, right?
Yeah.
So
exactly, and so naturalism is pretty much universally believed by atheists, though it's not necessarily true the other way around. If they're a naturalist, that doesn't mean they are an atheist.
Right.
They could be a pantheist.
Uh-huh.
But for the most part, if they're a naturalist, they're an atheist. So I have a quote here from Richard Lewontin, I believe is his name, an evolutionary bias and geneticist. So he says about naturalism, he says this: we take the side of science in spite of patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and instructions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Yeah, so I thought that was a very interesting quote because it very clearly illustrates how this is an assumption, not and it's an assumption that people feel is useful, but that's not necessarily the case. And as we talked about last year in our philosophy of science thing, there are many assumptions that science makes that really are not able to be explained fully by naturalism.
And just because it works so well within the scientific method, if we put these constraints on it and hold these assumptions, doesn't mean when we apply it to other disciplines it's not true.
And science isn't everything.
Yeah, that's kind of
there are so many things. Like when we're talking about historical investigation, we made the very clear point that it isn't science. Science is something that you can see, observe, test, repeat, right? You can do that. You can come up with possible experiments to determine whether or not your scenario is true. We cannot do that for history. We can't go back and test stuff. We can't set up the same scenario over and over and over again. You know, we can't crucify Jesus 1,000 times to figure out if he rises back from the dead again. So it isn't science. And to try to use a scientific perspective on this is important. We do use scientific tools, aka tools that have been produced by science in our historical investigation, but we cannot just by the nature of the thing, use science itself.
Yeah, very good point. So we're doing pretty good on time. Do we have any questions about what we kind of covered there? I know it's a little bit heady, but it's like kind of the introduction into how we can actually
Do naturalists believe exclusively in a physical explanation to everything?
So define physical. So a naturalist believes that only natural law and the forces derived from those laws exist. Now, as to the physicality of those laws, I don't know what position a naturalist would take. A materialist would say yes. The answer is yes. Only the material world exists. But a materialist and a naturalist are not exactly the same, though they're mostly the same.
Right. That's actually an important distinction. Yeah.
But so it is kind of an interesting thing where maybe I could imagine someone saying, I'm a naturalist, but then include God in the idea of a natural law or whatever. But that is not what they're going for. Naturalism is pretty much the idea of if it can be figured out by us mathematically, which is why I came up with this thing. If it can be figured out by us mathematically, then it's a natural law and it will always behave consistently no matter what. It doesn't change. And
I wonder if a good way to describe
it is not
that
personal, I guess. Yeah.
Sure. I wonder if a good way to describe that concept is the deists, like the founding fathers, because they were naturalists and they believed in God, but they believed that miracles couldn't happen because they held the assumption of naturalism to be higher than the assumption that God could do what he wants. Right.
Yeah.
So it's like it's kind of I don't know, because like
it is pretty weird. I will say once again, like anyone who holds this view really is an atheist. So the particular view of naturalism compared to the atheistic view of naturalism, it really in practice isn't that different. Though naturalism itself doesn't claim that much more than what is here. So
the philosophies can stand by themselves and they can be integrated with each other. Like there's a whole spectrum of acceptance. There's some kind of common areas. And some total acceptance, some total exclusion.
Exactly. And if you get into this conversation with someone who is an atheist who's prone to talking about philosophical topics, they might say, well, if that's your definition of God, then yeah, I believe in God.
Yeah.
But really what it comes down to is they believe in this particular concept of the fundamentals of reality, and that basically by their definition excludes the Christian God.
Right.
Like I said, you do have pantheists. You do have people saying like, well, we're all God because we're all controlled by the forces of natural law, and so then that would be God. That's not what atheists believe.
Yeah.
And it really depends, I guess, individualistically, it depends on what you put the priority at. The idea that I can believe in creation, whether science backs that up or not, because if I'm basing it on the Bible, that's my starting point. But if your starting point is naturalism and you're open to ideas of biblical truth, but that's your really your standard,
Yep.
you're going to see it differently.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And-
And so,
Yeah, sorry. I think that's a key point about like those philosophies starting to intertwine with each other, because we take the Christian worldview, we actually have to take a scientific standpoint on God creating the universe. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just kind of interesting. We're kind of taking one view and we're mixing it into another philosophically. So
Yeah.
yeah, they're all intertwined. You know.
yeah, for sure. So yeah, and J. Warner Wallace in his book goes through this similar sort of idea that the only real problem that naturalists have with the New Testament is miracles. And so very often they're willing to accept quite significant portions of things as long as it's not talking about something that would violate something that they hold more deeply.
Would they like not necessarily like believe in the Holy Spirit as well, because that is more supernatural?
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
correct.
I mean, there's probably, I think to an outsider, miracles is probably the only thing that it, but to a Christian that has read the Bible, you got the Holy Spirit, you got spiritual warfare, you got angels,
got a lot, yeah.
you got, oh
Yeah.
man, it just,
Yeah.
other realms.
Yeah, exactly. So he says,
But a materialist would believe in all of that.
no, a materialist would not. A materialist would believe that only physical things are real.
Yeah.
That there is nothing that
Which one
is
was
real
the one you
besides
said that
physical
like
things.
believed in like others like?
Oh, pantheists.
Okay,
A pantheist might believe that, though they would. Yeah, so pantheists, some are naturalistic and some would not be naturalistic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's kind of getting into the weeds a little bit.
But anyway, so J. Warner Wallace says in his book, scientists aren't alone. Many historians are also committed to a naturalistic presupposition.
Right.
And yeah, there's that word again. It goes along with the idea of assumption. It's something that you come up with first before engaging with the material. He says, most historical scholars, for example, accept in a limited way the historicity of the New Testament Gospels, insofar as they describe the life and teaching of Jesus and the condition of the first century environment in which Jesus lived and ministered. In fact, if the ancient accounts related to Jesus didn't include any descriptions of miraculous events, no virgin birth, no resurrection, no miraculous healings, nor demonstration of supernatural power, I doubt any significant scholar would doubt the accuracy of the Gospels in their entirety.
Right.
So once again, because of this presupposition of naturalism, this idea that only the natural law exists and nothing outside of that can ever possibly occur, then they come with that presupposition and then they say, hey, you know what, the Gospels, they seem pretty reliable except for these parts that disagree with my worldview.
Yeah. 100%.
So yeah, and so now we're going to get into the other side of that argument,
Miracles.
and specifically talking about miracles.
So I'm taking all this. I got about 5 minutes here. Going to go through 5 minute. What's that called? Where you like get the quick notes of a
Rundown,
book.
yeah, something like that. Oh yeah,
I can't
Cliff
remember.
notes.
Spark notes. Cliff notes. Yeah, Cliff notes of miracles by C.S. Lewis. So he describes it in like kind of 3 main points here. So Kal did a great job of setting up what the naturalist believes. But C.S. Lewis says that what we're really doing is we're observing the laws of nature. And he likes to break the laws of nature into 2 parts, right? He says there's descriptive and then there's prescriptive. And he says this means that we observe things, but there is not a reason to believe that they will continue in that way, right? So we can describe the way that things are, the things that we see, or there can be a prescription of the way that that's going to be from like basically a creator standpoint, right? It's like it's prescribing it versus us just describing it. So he says that what we do is we observe laws that take place and we describe them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're prescribed to be that way all the time. So it's an assumption to say that these can never be violated. And when you really break that down, if we're just going to look at this from a purely rational standpoint of we can make these observations of these natural processes that take place, right? Like water always in the Red Sea stays with gravity, and it's just the waves, and those are the sorts of things that we see there. The question is, could that law be broken, right? Like, does it have to be that way, or could it be split so that the nation of Israel could walk through it? And just from a rational standpoint, it seems like the more inclusive way, or at least a more rational way to look at it, is to say it could be broken, right? That it usually is this way, but it doesn't mean it has to always be this way.
Yeah.
And C.S. Lewis says that's 100% true from a rationalist standpoint. And then when it is broken, we just call that a miracle, right?
Yeah.
So he breaks down really simple for us to kind of see it that way. Natural processes.
And it makes a ton of sense, right? It's
Mhm.
this idea that the law has to come from somewhere, and that us simply observing it does not create it.
Right.
If
Right.
you observe a car accident, you're just
Mhm.
watching it. You don't create the car accident, but the naturalist, C.S. Lewis and many other philosophers argue
Mhm.
that we're trying to say, hey, no, the natural law is this, and by observing it, we just are figuring out, what it is. So
Yeah, exactly. It's taking an observation at the world, saying it takes place this way. So now I'm going to build my entire assumption that it's always that way.
yeah.
But it's not even probably most evangelicals, it's not that it can be broken, it was broken.
It was broken and it could be broken again, right?
Yeah.
And so from an evangelical standpoint, this is what C.S. Lewis gets into then. So he says, okay, so that you gotta take that as true, right?
Yeah.
It's like why do we?
Though if you get to the point with someone where they agree with you that it can be broken, you're 90%
Sure.
there.
Right, exactly.
I
Right.
argue.
Very, very
Much
important.
closer to the doctor.
So, and that's what his main thing is, like, you just make this assumption it can't be broken. Like, let's just pretend it could. And then he says, now from the Christian perspective, if God does exist, he probably will break it. Because the deists say that God could do it, but he doesn't do it, right? So then it's like, well, let's say he does exist, he can do it, and he wants to demonstrate his own nature to us. That's like the easiest way to do it, right? Everything goes through on this one consistent, studyable pattern.
Yeah.
And then God can step in and say, I'm going to step that
Yeah.
pattern.
The idea that God
So-
is personal, right?
Mhm. Yep, God's personal. That's how he shows his personality.
Yeah.
Right?
And he's all powerful.
He's all powerful.
Yeah, exactly.
So he can.
So to go along with this, mathematician and philosopher Dr. John Lennox says in Can Science Explain Everything? He says, the law of gravity gives us a brilliant way of calculating the effect of gravity. It does not tell us what gravity actually is.
Yeah.
And this is why you're always seeing them, hey, can we figure out this? Can we figure out this, right?
Mhm.
It's always deeper and deeper and deeper. And at every point, you always still have those questions of why. Why in terms of meaning, and why in terms of continual structure underneath.
Yeah, that's what C.S. Lewis means by the descriptive versus the prescriptive.
Yep, exactly. And C.S. Lewis in Miracles says, they produce no events, they state the pattern to which every event must conform, just as the rules of arithmetic state the pattern to which all transactions with money must conform, if only you can get hold of any money. Thus, in one sense, the laws of nature cover the whole field of space and time. In another way, what they leave out is precisely the whole real universe, the incessant torrent of actual events which make up true history.
Yeah, which is great.
That must come from somewhere else. Once
Yeah.
again, simply because we can see it doesn't mean that's the thing itself.
Yeah.
The car accident had to have come from somewhere. We can't just simply describe the car accident and then say, well, that's it.
Yeah, and the other thing about that, that's a little convoluted, very philosophical, but like what he's saying is all the actions that actually take place are real, going on right now. So just because we make a description of something abstractly, that abstraction isn't true, it's the event that's true, right? So we can't just take that abstraction and say, now that applies to the real world when you actually have the thing taking place.
It's an argument of category error, that the naturalist says, well, what I can describe is what's real.
Mhm.
But you mentioned, and maybe I heard it wrong, that C.S. Lewis was a naturalist.
Oh,
No, he was not.
Yeah. He's a Christian philosopher.
He's
Yeah,
a
well, I
Christian
know,
philosopher.
it didn't make sense.
Yeah.
Oh, gotcha. So the naturalist makes that assumption that whatever I can describe and matches with what I observe is true, and anything apart from that is false. And it's like, well, you're quite possibly throwing out real events then, simply because
exactly.
you can't find a pattern to them.
Yeah. Yep. Sweet. Thanks guys for coming.
So yeah, so those really are conclusions. We have many ways to get it wrong: logical fallacies, cognitive biases, simple mistakes, etc. And assumptions can lead us to the wrong answer. So we have to keep an open mind. We don't necessarily have to take a particular position that miracles are definitely happen all the time versus miracles never happen all the time. You can genuinely keep an open mind in this, in
Mhm.
order to help you find the truth.
Right. Yeah. We actually take the more skeptical position by saying maybe it could happen. You know?
Yep, exactly. So,
Um,
um,
so, yeah, we're done. So, feel free to go.
thank you for coming.